Shakespeare in the Bush, written by Laura Bohannon in 1966, is a thought-provoking paper of an anthropologist who left Oxford for West Africa and discovered how deeply cultural worldview affects understanding and interpretation. The agenda for today's presentation is to quickly review the article overview, worldview and interpretation, ethnocentrism, a personal reflection, and my key takeaways. Shakespeare in the Bush, written by Laura Bohannon in 1966, is again a thought-provoking paper of an anthropologist who is actually Laura herself, who left Oxford for the Tiv in West Africa for a second time, and how the cultural differences make understanding and translations difficult. Before she left, a seemingly British friend mentioned that she did not understand Shakespeare, just as any American does not. Laura argued with her friend because she believed humans are basically the same everywhere in understanding general plots and motivation. To prove a point either way, the friend gave Laura a copy of Hamlet to study for the correct interpretation. As Laura studies the book in West Africa, she is asked to tell a story to the Tiv. She decides to retell Hamlet. It does not go anywhere near as well as she would have hoped because of extreme cultural relativism in the English language and culture compared to Tiv traditions. The article illustrates the impact of worldview on the interpretation of cultural meanings in several different ways. As Laura retells Hamlet to the Tiv homestead, many disconnects distort the story of Hamlet because the Tiv not only lack the words for certain things in their language, but they also lack the basic framework for certain concepts, as these concepts are not how they live in their culture. The first impact of the worldview difference as Laura is telling her story happens immediately as she begins. One night, 3 men were keeping watch outside the homestead of the great chief when suddenly they saw the former chief approach them. Instantly, the Tiv asked why was he no longer chief. Laura explained that he was dead and that is why they were afraid when the 3 men saw the chief. The Tiv replied that it is impossible because it was an omen sent by a witch. For the Tiv, a dead person could not appear as a spirit or ghost because there is no presence of people after death. For Laura, it is inconceivable for an omen to be sent by a witch. As Laura is teaching the concept of a ghost, a familiar one to her, she is not only trying to dispel their disbelief, but also teaching them an entirely new concept. As Laura tells her story, many phrases she must use to be understood in Tiv signal the underlying concept of witches. In contrast, in English, the concepts of scholars or drowning in water are common phrases not associated with witchcraft. Laura moves on to discuss the genealogy of who became chief and who remarried whom. The Tiv were very concerned about the genealogy and told Laura to ask the elders about it when she returned home. There was also a cultural difference. For the Tiv, 2 years is far too long to remarry, whereas Claudius and Gertrude behaved well by remarrying quickly. Kings, or chiefs, as the Tiv know, should have many wives as household managers, and there was much discourse that Hamlet was seeking revenge for his father's death. In Tiv tradition, his father's age mates should avenge him, not the younger generation. One ethnocentric bias within the article is apparent. As Laura is leaving Oxford, she protests to her friend that human nature is pretty much the same the whole world over. She is describing the story of Hamlet to the Tiv elders, and she is dumbfounded over the interpretive differences between their culture, her culture, and Hamlet's culture as she has interpreted it. In fact, the Tiv make a similar claim. We believe you when you say your marriage customs are different or your clothes and weapons, but people are the same everywhere. The Tiv are helping Laura understand the true meaning of Hamlet through their own cultural lens. They go on to say, therefore, there are always witches, and it is we, the elders, who know how witches work. That is not at all the true meaning of Hamlet that Laura has understood. Both Laura and the Tiv elders present ethnocentric bias in the article as their worldview has drastically shaped their interpretations of Hamlet. The Tiv are also unwilling to learn Laura's cultural values and the values intended in Hamlet. It is interesting to note that they, of course, would be unwilling to learn Laura's cultural values as they are the elders, therefore the wisest and most knowing of their cultural values. So why should they change? The Tiv are adamant with Laura in conversation to go home and talk to her elders, and that those in the room have taught her true wisdom. Laura is becoming cross and snappy as they are not understanding a simple story for her culture. Both believe that they are normal cultural values and are the best ones. However, Laura ends up mostly agreeing with the Tiv, slightly abandoning Hamlet's story. A specific and unique tradition in my Christian culture is that I believe that Jesus was born to a virgin, he lived for 33 years and died on a cross, and then eventually rose from the dead 3 days later. If this miraculous story that I based my life on were told to the Tiv, they would believe it was witchcraft and that Jesus was a zombie. They would probably think that I was crazy as well for associating myself with this story. I will refer back to my personal experiences of cultural misunderstandings when discussing my faith and biblical interpretation. My husband, who is now a Christian, and my brother-in-law, who is still agnostic, grew up together. My husband, Alec, was always more okay with the concept of Christianity and everything that it entailed, like believing in the life of Jesus. My brother-in-law, Luke, he won't say so, but he thinks that we are crazy for believing in the life of Jesus, his miracles, God, and so on. He personally believes that if there is a God, it is not his business to know him or to seek him out. This worldview difference has influenced all our perceptions of reality and what we base our life on. Just as in the story, the three men see a ghost. They do not question that it is a ghost. However, the Tiv have no concept of a ghost. They cannot fathom one, and they assume it is a zombie or something reanimated, an act performed by the witches. A best practice for communication across cultures by incorporating insights on how worldview and perception influence interactions would be to, when possible, prepare communication ahead of time, taking into account the insights of that culture and worldview, as well as the traditions. I thought that Laura started out well by referring to the king as a chief. However, she could have abandoned the English cultural traditions of Hamlet and made it a more moving story for the Tiv by not discussing a ghost, Hamlet seeking revenge, having many wives, or using words closely associated with witchcraft. The most significant lesson I gained from this article regarding the impact of worldview and perception in intercultural communication is not to become distressed by someone not understanding my worldview and culture. In the story, Laura becomes snappy, shaken, and even cross when they were not appreciating her story as it is, simply because they did not even have a concept of some parts of it. It is a great reminder as I share my faith, testimony, my worldview with those who have different worldviews, that they might never have been exposed to these concepts, and I need to practice patience as I first teach them the concepts, then the message of my faith. Thank you for listening to my presentation regarding Shakespeare in the Bush and my worldview and cultural interpretation of it. Here you can see I've listed my reference for Shakespeare in the Bush, published by the Natural History magazine.